Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site covering, of course, the Arizona Cardinals. And with me is my co-host, Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, which is the Arizona Cardinals site from SB Nation, and also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast. And this is episode 369, which is our last show before final cuts. Because of how schedules work, the next show we will know what at least the initial final 53 is going to look like. And so, I mean, Seth, we're less than 3 weeks away from the regular season. We've got 2 out of 3 preseason games in the books, and it really feels like there is both a lot of certainty of who's going to be in the roster and a lot of question marks, right?
Yeah, I mean, you and I were talking a little bit off the air. It feels like the top 27, 28 are real easy. And then after that, you're like, how are we going to make this all fit? And so that's going to be what's interesting because, you know, we've got some additions to discuss, which, I mean, this late in the training camp is a little different, especially because it's not
it's not a cornerback.
Well, not just that, but it's not anybody that we're assuming is going to start.
Right. That's what we're going to be talking about. So in this show, we're going to talk about, and I think what we'll, honestly, I'm going to throw in an extra thing that I didn't mention. So we'll start with the Ravens game, the game on Sunday where the Cardinals lost 24-17 to the Baltimore Ravens. What did we think of that game? We're going to talk about the trade for Cody Ford, which was kind of came out of nowhere. We'll talk about the cuts that they made, because they made 5-player cuts as they had to get down to 80 players, if there's any surprise there. We will talk about potential trade candidates if the Cardinals could possibly move before final rosters are set. And then we will do our 53-man roster projection. Based on what we know through 2 games in the preseason and training camp, we're going to try and put together a roster, at least an initial roster, as we know that the final 53 is really the first final 53 before they finagle things. So that's kind of how we'll treat this show. Starting off, of course, with the game against the Ravens, the Cardinals were unable to end the winning streak of the Baltimore Ravens, who have now won 22 straight preseason games. But even in the loss, the 24-17 loss, there were both good things that you liked, and of course things we didn't like. Let's talk about sort of what were any negatives or worries that for you came up in that game?
I mean, I don't know if negatives are the right word or worries, because so few guys that we expect to contribute were on the roster, or not on the roster, but, playing. But when you look at, let's start on the offensive side of the ball. When you look at the offense, there were a couple of things. I think first off, obviously it stunk that Will Hernandez wasn't able to play. Obviously that's not a bad thing in the sense of as long as he's healthy, but he, we wanted to see him run it back one more time because he was so good in that first preseason game. And it kind of showed how thin they were along the interior offensive line. I mean, you saw Rashad Coward and Coda Martin both look really, really bad at times in this game. You look at Lacita Smith and Greg Long, they're young guys trying out different positions. I was less worried about their step back in play this week. But it did get you a little like, okay, this is, it kind of cleared up who the top backups are, right, along the offensive line.
Absolutely. I think for sure you feel comfortable with both tackles. You feel comfortable with Harlow. And then after that, you're like, well.
Yeah, and so they and it's funny because they went and did something about it. So that was the offense. That was all on offense. I thought it was unfortunate that a guy like Victor Bolden had some opportunities and wasn't able to.
He left plays on the field.
Right.
We'll put it that way.
Right. And you just get disappointed for the player in that sense because, we knew it was going to be a long road to hoe for him to make this roster, but you wanted to see like a guy like him, like Chris Pierce, those guys play well with the chance to either be on the practice squad or find their way onto another roster. And it was kind of a tale of two sides. Pierce played really well in that game. Whereas, Bolden had some issues, and then on defense, you look at it, they are woefully thin. If anything happens to Isaiah Simmons, Budda Baker, Jalen Thompson, right? Like, my goodness, Isaiah Likely just destroyed them. and it's not something you worry about when you're talking about those three players not being on the field. Like, all of a sudden you're like, well, I mean, I'm not worried about it. But then you think to yourself, wait, those are the next guys up, right?
Yeah.
So like that becomes a depth concern because Joe Walker was okay playing against the run. James Wiggins,
he's been up and down. I think for me the biggest negative is the only word it comes out of this. Granted, it's not with the starters, but you hate to see bad tackling.
Yes,
because the bad tackling will undo any good defensive discipline in terms of gaps in scheme and game plan. And if you just don't tackle a guy, those turned into big plays. And I know there was one, Deontay Thompson, a guy we know, he's a big hitter. He went for the ball instead of the tackle. And granted, preseason is when you do that. But it ended up being a big play. Wiggins, there were a couple of times where there's busted coverage and that, the Ravens had a wide open receiver down the field. And they ended up not scoring a touchdown on that drive, but you're like, ooh, there is some busts in coverage out there because there was a guy wide open down the field twice, like in a row. And the main thing is that you didn't get that. Well, I didn't like the fact that the offense, because the offense looked so good against Cincinnati. Now, and I'll give you this: the Ravens are a different animal with the preseason. I don't know how much they game plan. I'm guessing they do some opponent-specific game planning as a culture, so that they're still maintaining that standard of winning games. But it was, they weren't as sharp offensively. Trace McSorley.
I was going to say McSorley.
You know what it reminded me of? When Colt McCoy had that really good game, first game, and then the second game against Carolina. That's what this reminded me of. It reminded me of Colt McCoy's second start.
And you look at it, it kind of goes hand in hand with how bad the interior offensive line played. The tackles I thought were, again, fantastic. We talked, Josh Jones is, man, all of a sudden you look at it, I mean, and because of the, age of Kelvin Beachum, you would never trade Josh Jones straight up just because you don't want to give up a 25-year-old tackle. But
he really looks good at left tackle.
Just like, he's a guy you're like, hey, if you could get a top flight type of corner, for like Josh Jones in a 2, it's something that you actually think about now, because he's just looked so good. I mean, again, it's really hard to sacrifice a 25-year-old tackle, but
well, it also depends because, nothing against Josh Miles has been solid, and he's a guy who develops slowly coming out of small school. So, like, I wouldn't want them to trade Josh Jones because he's on track to be a starting tackle starting next year, and you never know how depth of injuries are going to go. I mean, and Sean Kugler said it. He said he'll be a starter. He could be a starter this year, and he feels that Jones is good enough to start, especially at tackle. And he says when you've got 3 tackles that you feel with your backup you're comfortable with starting, you've got some pretty good tackles. And I think they're at that state. And I would hate to see them trade away Josh Jones because, like, starting caliber tackles, you don't want to deal them, especially when they haven't cost you anything.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but that goes right into and don't get me wrong, McSorley was really bad. And it wasn't just the interceptions. Like the one interception, the early interception, he missed his hot. They came back to the play on the left side. He hit it. It is what it is. But if you go back to the game, there's a lot of throws that Cliff and Kyler both called that are open throws where he's not under duress and he just misses.
There were a couple of times there were clear miscommunications too.
Yeah, and so, that's just a situation where everybody likes Trace McSorley, but there's a reason that, like, he's a 3rd string quarterback in the NFL. And trust me, like, he's better than he on his worst day he'd be better than I could ever be at anything. But, like, you can still say, like, he looked really bad at times, and that was unfortunate. And then I think when you look at the defense, it wasn't so much that they were bad, but I feel like we want to see a little more pass rush juice from the rookies.
Yes.
It's not that they've been bad.
They're just not getting there because you saw, like, we've seen Myjai Sanders look good. He just hasn't finished. Cam Thomas, you saw him, like, you were seeing an impact on the field, but he wasn't finishing. I was really worried about, like, pass coverage. They were just picked apart. Just like they got their hands on exactly one pass the entire game.
Yeah, and that's something that's going to have to. I mean, it isn't surprising that those two things kind of coincide, right? That you've got guys that need to step up in terms of making, like, the Josh Jackson one. Josh Jackson was in the right spot and he just didn't make a play on the ball. And that's kind of been his career, right? It's like,
yes,
it's not that he's a bad or out of position. It's just that hasn't shown the athleticism to finish consistently, or whether it's the athleticism or the understanding to finish consistently. And so, you look at Jackson and James Wiggins, like you talked about the up and down nature of his play. Those two really stand out because they had opportunities to make a play on the ball, and they just, for whatever reason, they're not there yet. And that's where the concern starts to creep in, because, again, it's not so much that they're going to be starting, but it's like they're literally like the next guy up. And so you look at it and you go, man, if anything were to happen, that's a quick fall off the cliff.
I will say this about the Ravens in terms of the passing game. They're a tough team to match up with, simply because they do all their passing game to the tight end and backs. Their receiver play is kind of second, which is one of the reasons why
super limited.
It's super limited, and when you're playing second or third string safeties and linebackers, that's going to show up in a hurry, especially when you've got. And I will say this, that I despised the crazy overreaction, some of the hyperbole that there was about Isaiah. Like he looked good. Now, the next great American tight end, and I took some crap for please, these are against second and third stringers, and I want to do celebrate it, recognize where he's playing well, but don't anoint him yet, especially when he wasn't doing it against Isaiah Simmons or even Zaven Collins. Let's be honest, he wasn't even doing it against Zaven Collins. This is Joe Walker, this is James Wiggins and Charles Washington, and Deontay Thompson, guys who aren't going to be seeing defensive snaps. That said, I think that particular offense was hard. It just didn't match up well for the Cardinals defensively for their, the personnel that they had on the field for the preseason game.
Yeah, and then you look at the other side. I mean, there's still some really, really positive things that came out of this game.
Zaven looked better.
Yeah, Zaven was better. You talked about it. He's got to tackle more consistently. But I think that's kind of the next step in his maturation is like he's picking up the speed of the game. His eyes are getting better. This is something you and I have talked about off the air and a little bit on the air. And one of our big misses on Zaven, and it's not that he's a bust or anything like that, but one of our big misses on Zaven, and something that like I'm learning more as I coach and then can take it to, this aspect of things is like when you play, and this is going to sound really negative, so I don't want it to be taken that way. It's just, it is what it is. When you play in a fake defense like Zaven did in college, it's really hard to translate that to the NFL. And at Tulsa, they're running a 3-3-5 or whatever that stupid thing is. And he was basically allowed to, roam kind of like what they.
So while he was a Mike, he wasn't having to he wasn't having to do complex things to call the defense and counter things because that's how you do it in college. You're just trying to fill space.
Right. And so like it just.
And that's.
And so like he was really good at it, but like when he's coming into a defensive scheme and he's having to play within a scheme, it makes sense that he's progressing in a slower manner. And you look at it, like you said, now his eyes are in the right spot. And that's like the progression. And people will still be like, yeah, but I mean, look at the tackles he missed. I agree 1000%. Like that's the next step in the evolution. But last year, he wasn't even able to make an attempt to miss the tackle. He wasn't in
He was
position.
completely out of the play. Yeah, he was completely out of the play. And something we noted, and I think this is something to note for players, prospects like Zaven Collins, who were highly productive and things like that, is that it's unfair when you take a guy who played lower competition, subpar competition in college, and then take him in the first round at a highly complex position and expect him to, and then to say on draft night he's your starting Mike. And whether or not he was the right pick for the Cardinals, he was definitely a Cardinals pick. The expectations placed on him immediately were. They did him a disservice in terms of perception.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been an issue all along. I think Antonio Hamilton continues to look really good. Again, it's preseason. You hit the nail on the head in terms of the Ravens wide receiver situation, but you can only go up against what the opponent in front of you.
And when it comes to Antonio Hamilton, and we'll look at this. Let's say this 2 years ago. The Cardinals' pass defense in 2020, when they got maybe the overall average cornerback play, maybe a slightly above average cornerback play from Patrick Peterson, you got adequate cornerback play from Drake Kirkpatrick, and then decent play in the slot. The way the Cardinals' defensive scheme works, you do not need great cornerback play. You only need adequate cornerback play for the defense to work. And if Antonio Hamilton is giving you that, granted, his career high in defensive snaps was last year, where he had 312 defensive snaps. He was adequate last year. If he is a step above that this year and is able to be healthy all year, he's not a player that as fans you feel comfortable with, like when you're rooting for a team. But he's reliable. If he's reliable enough, kind of like, Cardinals fans hate it, how Vance Joseph trusts guys like Tanner Vallejo and Joe Walker. But there's a reason why, because if they mentally if they can schematically be in the right spot and make the right reads, more often than not, even if they get beat physically, they're still going to end up with a positive outcome.
Yeah, and that's what you're looking at. I will say too, I thought Marco Wilson looked a lot better in this game. I think he dropped into coverage 8 times, and I don't have him having to have defended anything. I'm double checking my notes. Yeah, he had no pass attempts thrown his way, but in the coverages, he looked like he was in phase a lot better, which, is a big deal.
Right. It's a step in the right direction. We wanted to see kind of flashes of good, but after there were mistakes last week, to see him go from mistake to you didn't notice things good or bad, that's a step in the right direction. It is.
And then, I think when you look at the defensive line, we talked about this before, but it's the Corey Peters effect. And I think we're seeing that come to fruition with Rashard Lawrence and Michael Dogby. I think that they're not flashy players by any means, but they're guys that are always kind of seemingly in the right spot.
Absolutely. That's and they really like with a defensive scheme that you've got, you need you want at minimum for your defense to be successful, your defensive linemen to be reliably decent. If that's big, then that allows, if you have one or two guys that are playmakers, as long as you guys have guys that aren't messing things up, you have schematically, you don't have people out of position, you don't have them giving up plays. They're doing their job, and you can live with a defense that just doesn't give up plays, even if they're not making great plays. You can win like that, especially with a team like the Cardinals, who offensively should be great. They should be great this year. And so your defense, and like last year, at the beginning of last year, their defense was great, which is why they were so good. But that defense doesn't have to be great. It has to be adequate. It has to be adequate if the Cardinals are offensively are great. And if they're going to do that, they'll be fine. They will be fine as a team.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think it's going to be unfortunate because, and I think a lot of it's this offense. So, take this with a grain of salt, but Jontre Kirkland, Andy Isabella, I talked about Chris Pierce a little bit, and then obviously Greg Dortch have all looked just really, really good. And,
it was funny. Kirkland it's like Jared Guarantano, that's his favorite guy. But I will say, the fact, Andy Isabella, who's whatever's happened with him, unlucky, this or that, playing out of position. What you've seen from Isabella this year in the preseason, he's consistently beating people. So he's getting separation. We even saw him go out and make a catch in his hands in front of him, which is progress. So you're seeing improvement there. Greg Dortch just, normally today's NFL is different, so you can have guys with their stature in an offense that's this spread out make plays. But Dortch continues to make. He wasn't as good. I will say he was not as good as he was in the first game because there were a couple of mistakes. But Isabella, he's been very consistently okay. I don't know if it's enough for the roster, but you gotta like it.
Yeah, and it's just important for him to continue to improve because it is slightly disappointing that he was never able to meet his expectations. But you know, overall, despite the loss, I thought there was a lot of good, especially on the defense side of the ball, and I think that we saw that there is some, concerns from the depth of this team on the defense side of the ball, and on the interior offensive line. But we also saw that they're not afraid to go make a move to make sure they can fix it.
And I will say this: it was exciting. It was fun to see Kyler Murray giving Kyler the headsets to call plays. If the team, I don't know if it's just the need that the team has of trying to keep pushing the Kyler Murray narrative that he's improving this and improving that, or if this is the guy he always was. It's kind of like it's a really fun wrinkle to the preseason in the fourth quarter when you have your starting quarterback calling plays and getting fired up and doing those things, especially in the context of everything that's been said about Kyler as a leader, as a teammate. You can tell either the narrative was off base or he's really making strides.
Well, and I think a lot of it is he's such a competitive guy. And so when you give him something to be competitive about, like calling plays, he takes it very seriously.
Yeah, it's fun. And if you hear, this is kind of like what he's been doing, played in Madden all those years. All that video game play,
right? Exactly.
All that video game play comes into play. Anyway, coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's break down the Cody Ford trade, the surprise trade that came earlier this week. Let's go on next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals Talk on the Web. Everyone in town was waiting for a trade, but everyone was waiting for a trade for a cornerback. Suddenly, Monday afternoon, comes the news of a trade with the Cardinals for an offensive lineman that isn't going to start. So they traded with the Buffalo Bills, 5th-round draft pick, for Cody Ford, former Oklahoma tackle Cody Ford, former teammate of Kyler Murray, and it seems like this is, as someone said, this is becoming Southwest Norman or Norman Southwest out here as they're trying to collect all the Oklahoma players. Cody Ford is an interesting move because it to me, it signals one of two things, and this was before Cliff Kingsbury said anything about it on Tuesday. It signified that they were ready to move on from a player, that they were going to cut a player, that they were ready to cut someone that perhaps we all anticipated being on the roster, or two, there's an injury or injuries we don't know about yet in terms of severity.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Is like a lot of people were like, "Oh, Kyler's calling the shots and blah blah blah." I think there's two things to this. One is Steve Keim really liked Cody Ford coming out. They just didn't think that Byron Murphy was going to be there.
No, Byron was supposedly their number 5 player on their draft board.
Yeah, and so the two guys they were targeting there were N'Keal Harry and Cody Ford. So that could be a good / bad thing, right? So when you look at,
like, what does that say about them with their draft? But no, here's the thing. On the surface, if we think, okay, maybe they're moving on. I think if you have to look at something, the thing that makes the most obvious that Cody Ford becomes a younger, cheaper Justin Murray, because he's not slated to be a starter. He can play guard and tackle, and Justin Murray, he has a cap hit of more than $2.5 million. And while Ford's going to be at about $1.5 million, I mean, it's minor savings, but he's 25 years old as opposed to Murray, who's 29. Murray, who missed nearly all last season with a back injury and has missed a significant amount of training camp time with an ankle. And so on the surface, to me, it looked like, okay, this is first and foremost, they're moving on from Justin Murray and potentially giving themselves, well, one, someone who can, in this offense, come in and be successful as he hasn't been as successful as people had hoped he would in Buffalo. I get it. He's underwhelmed as a player thus far.
Yeah, and you look at it, he started quite a few games for Buffalo, and I just said about Josh Jones, you usually don't trade young offensive linemen. So, if the Cardinals are looking at this in one of two ways, they're looking at this similarly to what they're doing with Will Hernandez, which is they want to give these guys, one last look closely. I'm fine with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, we talked about it off the air. You mentioned it. What's happening with Justin Pugh, who we know is out with a stinger. What's happening with Will Hernandez, who ended up missing the game. What's happening with, obviously Ford's not going to play center, but what's going on with Rodney Hudson? Is that going to cause Pugh to have to slide over? Like, there's all these questions. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you look at it and you say, oh, okay, they just want to create this depth. And I don't think that's a bad thing, especially when you talk about how much everybody complains about the lack of depth along the offensive line all the time.
Absolutely.
Or throw one more name in there. We haven't heard about Marquis Hayes lately. Like, is his injury going to be more significant than they're letting on right now?
That's the thing is with the preseason is hard is because, one, we don't get the full picture with injuries. They don't have to talk about injuries. And the timeline is... it's hazy at best. Justin Murray is supposed to be out 1 to 2 weeks. I don't know if he's practiced since he had the foot/ankle. Justin Pugh missed. Will Hernandez tweaked his ankle. Marquis Hayes got a thing going on, and so you're like, well, what do we do? And which is why they brought Greg Long back after they cut him initially, because they needed the bodies. They needed the bodies on the offensive line, and so Ford is like, if you're going to have him on your bench, it's not bad. I can see, like, if he ends up being the Justin Murray replacement, it makes perfect sense. Justin Murray costs more than Kelvin Beachum this year, if you can believe that. He is more expensive than Kelvin Beachum, their starting right tackle, and Murray, who's okay. Like, he's reliable. He's a guy that they like, but have never.
He's also had some injury issues the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So.
That's, and at the same time, he's a guy they trust, but he's not a guy that they. It's not like they looked at him and said, "Yep, we're set at that position."
And quite frankly, we've talked about this before. A guy like Justin Murray his career is something that should be applauded. And the fact that he stuck around, he was able to make a payday and get to where he is. That was he is a success. And, if they end up moving on from him, which again, we don't know, we're just, we're kind of spinning our wheels on why this trade might have gone down. You tip your cap to him and say, hey, great job, man. Like, you made it a long time in this league, and maybe he gets picked up somewhere else. Maybe he ends up on the practice squad, since there's all these rules now with practice squad. So, but like, he's got to feel good about what he accomplished.
Absolutely. And with that, coming up next on the Rise Up Seaward podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, let's move on and talk about cuts and potential trade candidates coming up. So that's coming up next on Rise Up Seaward. We're back on the Rise Up Seaward podcast, the best of Cardinals talk. The Cardinals made some roster moves. They had to get their roster down to 80, actually 81 players, since Bernhard Zajkovic, their international, their Austrian tight end, is an exemption still this offseason. And then if he doesn't make the team, then they have an exemption on the practice squad for him, I believe, this year as well. When they made the trade for Cody Ford, they cut receiver Marcel Aitman. Nothing surprising about that. Then the other cuts that they announced on Tuesday were running back T.J. Pledger, cornerback Cortez Davis. I'm going to have to. The punter Nolan Cooley, tight end, he didn't even make it a week. Josh Hokett, who was the former, when we talked last week, he hadn't been signed yet. He's a former 49ers fullback that they had on practice squad behind Kyle Juszczyk. And they signed him last week to become a tight end, and less than a week later, he played one snap on offense, and then he released him. And then undrafted rookie Darrell Baker, Jr., cornerback, was waived injured, so he was waived with an injury designation. So does
that mean he collects a paycheck on that?
It will mean that if he doesn't get claimed, he gets placed on injured reserve, where, depending on the severity of the injury, he could end up with an injury settlement of some sort. Now, he already had some guaranteed money for a salary. When they signed him, they guaranteed, I think it was $10,000 of his salary.
Right.
So he'll end up on IR if he's not claimed, and at some point might get an injury settlement, or he's out for the year.
And then all these guys, I think we've talked about this before, but all these guys get paid the exact same, right? During training camp.
Yeah,
outside of bonuses.
Yes,
but they're weekly. They each get.
There is a tier for veterans. They get their per diem, but that doesn't count against the salary cap. That's just part of their off-season pay, which isn't. Let's be honest. It might be decent for many working Americans, but it's peanuts.
It's peanuts.
It's peanuts in the NFL.
yeah. But yeah, so all these guys, when we talk about injury settlements, that's something that happens is that when they get placed with the injury designation, it's actually a big thing for players typically, because it allows them that those insurance claims and things like that, where if they can basically get some cash if they, like you said, if they don't get picked up. Whereas if they're just straight up cut, and then nobody picks them up, they're unless they had, like you said, bonus money or something guaranteed, they're out of luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there was not a single surprise in these cuts at all. None whatsoever. They were all back of the roster guys. I was almost expecting maybe a Justin Murray cut, one of those surprise things. Like last week, it was Kingsley Keke, when you're like, that the kind of the guys that they give, or after in the middle of last week, Jesse Lemonnier was cut as well to make room for it was Hokett, I think it ended up being, because they needed bodies at the tight end.
But it's also one of those things, and I think you do an excellent job of explaining this, and a lot of people just don't listen or don't understand it, but it's a really big deal for players if you aren't going to make the roster, that you get cut early enough to go find another team. And so the thing with Liminaire and TJ Pledger, who have both played well, that was probably done more as a courtesy to them,
right?
Than
if you cut them when there's 100 players being cut and on waivers all at the same time, that's significantly different than when you've got 500 to 800 players. You've got 800 players that are suddenly on waivers after training camp is over, after all the preseason practices. It's really, really hard after that. And so this gives them at least a puncher's chance of getting interest from some other team somewhere.
Correct. And so, yeah, like you said, this was this was the most like vanilla, not surprising.
like,
well,
a week ago, Seth was asking who Cortez Davis was, if you recall on the show last week.
Right. Well, and then he didn't even play this last game.
No,
which is like, that's the golden sign that a cut is coming. Like literally, like unless you're one of the starters, but like, or like a key backup like a Colt McCoy. Like if you're not getting run in the preseason, yeah, like pack them bags, bro. Like it's you're out of here. And so that wasn't shocking. I always feel bad for the guys like the tight end that like come in or here for 6 days and then get cut because like you said, they needed a body. Like the whole point of it was, if anything, like if Trey McBride stepped wrong in the game and he was like, oh God, my back kind of hurts, they're going to be like, hey, you're out. Like that was the whole thing. So you saw Trey be able to make it through the whole game, no issues, knock on wood. And then so from there it was like, all right, well, I guess we'll get this Hokit guy some work. We brought him in.
Well, it's funny because Cliff Kingsbury had no idea who he was when they asked about it. He literally knew nothing about the dude. And so he was a guy that Keim signed. It was something from their personnel departments, decided to pick him up. And when Cliff was asked about him after the signing, he's like, I don't know anything about him.
Well, you got to remember too, like we've talked about before. So, Steven Anderson. Well, I don't know if either of us wrote about it because again, they don't give us any information. So I guess technically we're not allowed to like really discuss it. But like Steven Anderson was nicked up, and so all of a sudden it was Bernard Seikovits and Chris Pierce as your tight ends, right? And they really just use Pierce as like a H-back slot guy. They don't even really use him as a line guy.
He honestly, with how they're going to use Zach Ertz, that he was playing Zach Ertz's position.
Right. I mean, because you got to remember, he's only 230 pounds. Like he's a slight tight end. And so like, that's the thing is you bring in a guy like Hokit and like he gets all the reps during the week and gets the crap kicked out of him. Then he gets one freaking play in the game and you're like, oh, this poor guy. But like, yeah, those are the guys I feel bad for. But like, yeah, overall, just a really vanilla, cut down. They also got moved on from Marcel Aitman to make room for Cody Ford. Again, Aitman was only here for when Antoine Wesley got hurt. So maybe that's good news on Wesley, right? Or they're just like, we've got guys in Jontre Kirkland and Javonte Payton who are playing better than Aitman did, so we'll keep them, for the time being. So, I nothing surprising. I think there's some names that still really stick out that are going to be gone.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that soon. But before we get to our roster predictions, and the reason why we're doing roster predictions, I think I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the reason why we're going to be doing roster predictions now is even before the final preseason game, it's because of how they changed the schedule. It used to come on a Saturday, and I will tell you this as a professional in terms of media, I am so glad that they stopped making cut down day on a Saturday because the Cardinals were notoriously bad about, of cut down time. Like they had to be by 1 p.m. Arizona time. They wouldn't release their cuts until almost 4 o'clock. They were one of the last teams every single year. And on a Saturday, so this on a weekend with all these people who are working, most reporters are, in the week stuff, except during actual football. And Saturday is definitely not normally a NFL working day. Waiting around all day for those cuts to be announced. Now they come on a Tuesday, which means they can sign practice squad guys Wednesday. They get a couple of days of practice and then a mini bye before the season, then a full week. So the guys that they bring in off that they claim off waivers or re-sign to the practice squad, you actually get a couple of days of work in before your game week of practice. I really like the schedule, but again, going back to why we're going to be doing the roster predictions now is because the next show that we will record will come after they've already made their final cuts. So we have to make our predictions now. But before we do that,
it's going to be a reaction to the cuts.
Yes, we will react to the first cuts, which will then be, when by the time the show publishes, will probably be outdated because they'll have claimed guys off waivers, made trades, put guys on IR, things like that.
But that also makes it fun for us because then we get to be like, this is the guy that they're gonna cut or IR.
Yeah.
So like he won't, like we get to make those guesstimates too after we see the initial 53-man roster.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we do that, let's talk about the possible. The Cardinals have a number of guys on their roster that could be surprise cuts, but they actually have a little bit of value somewhere. So perhaps instead of just cutting some guys, there are a few guys on the roster that might have value elsewhere. And we'll kind of go through the positions. I think a surprise name, and this is something I thought of in the last week, as they have a really, really packed running back room. It feels like right now they have 5 guys they legitimately would love to have on the roster, and I don't think they're going to be able to keep 5. I just don't think there's any viable way to keep 5 running backs on the roster, even initially. Darrell Williams, who played 4 snaps, and they really, like Cliff Kingsbury's praised a lot, wouldn't he be an interesting trade chip somewhere because of the fact that while he's not a dynamic starter, he's a perfect backup because he does everything pretty well. He's not great at anything. He's a solid blocker. He's a solid pass catcher. He's solid between the tackles. He's a productive runner. But the Cardinals have young guys that they're excited about. So they're excited about Benjamin. Jonathan Ward has been more than adequate, and there's some promise to this kid Keontae Ingram. And if you're going to trust those guys, Darrell Williams is the veteran guy who's played in a lot of big games. Maybe, just maybe, you could use him to trade elsewhere because if he's on the team, he's not getting cut because they guaranteed almost all of his salary.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it feels like, and I'm not saying him per se, but doesn't it feel like there are Darrell Williams available in the offseason, or not, sorry, in the season every single year? Like there are players similar to Darrell Williams who you could be like, oh, you can go grab him instead of just going with, God forbid, Connor goes down and then Ingram gets hurt in a game and then it's going to miss a week or two. And so you're like, well, are we going to really go with Benjamin and Jonathan Ward for, and so that's the thing is like, it just feels like Williams is a player that has value to the right team in the right need, but is also highly, a guy you go out and get in free agency in week 6 and kind of knock the dust off, right?
Yeah. And I think so, Jonathan Ward, I think, also has some value, but kind of not really. Like, if there's anyone who you could trade, I think it's only, and unless they pull the thing what some people are speculating, they're really, really talking up Benjamin and then going to trade him to keep Darrell Williams as the backup, and then use Ward as special teams, as Ingram as your guy who you develop to be even better than in a year.
Yeah, and you look at, like I'm on right now, and like we're talking about it, so it's important, obviously. But you look at who's available. Obviously, Kenyon Drake just got let go, so Kenyon Drake's available. Obviously has a history with Cardinals. Then you look at other guys like David Johnson's available, Devontae Freeman's available, Latavius Murray is available. So there are guys that are maybe not as young as Darrell Williams, but can be used in the same way. So you say, if we can get a 7th that turns into a 6th, depending on playing time and usage, that then
and that's cheap. So he's
right.
making basically the league minimum, but granted it's almost all guaranteed, but it's a cheap addition.
but that also goes for Eno and Jonathan Ward. Like the only one that has like legitimate like intrigue value at this moment is Ingram, just because he's a young guy, and he's built differently than Benjamin, Williams, and Ward.
Right.
And so like that's the only reason. It's not that his value is better because he's a better player, so to speak. It's that he's the only kind of different style of guy. We another guy that you and I talked about off the air, and we love him, and he's kind of been the poster boy for development that we've discussed, is Joshua Miles.
Yeah.
He was a 7th rounder, I believe, right?
He was a 7th rounder. He's managed to stay on the team for 3 seasons. He's made progress. He's just not quite like they do like him, but he's also not quite what Josh Jones is, and so
yeah, he hasn't developed like Jones has, and so that's what you kind of look at.
But
right?
a young, athletic tackle, like remember the Cardinals got a 6th-round pick for Corey Cunningham.
Right, who's not doing anything. So that's the thing, is like, and people will look at it and go, well, you just gave up a 5th for Cody Ford. Okay, so if you get a 6th or 7th for Joshua Miles, you basically got the pick back that you drafted him
right.
with, and you got. And
here's the thing: Cody Ford, and Miles only has 1 year left on his contract as well. Ford has started football games, and Joshua Miles has played a few snaps.
Correct. And so but at the same time, he's a guy that if you look around the league, you're like, he might be better than some of these guys that are rolling out there, and so you look at it from that perspective. Obviously the big flashing light one is Andy Isabella and his development.
Because fast guys are always valuable somewhere.
Yeah, and it just feels like he has, I mean, we say this a lot, so maybe not, but it feels like he had turned a corner this year. He's playing at a faster pace. He seems more confident in himself, which is obviously something we had not seen consistently from him. And so, you're not going to get a 2. You're not going to get a 4, but you might be able to get a 5 that turns into a 4, right? Type of thing. More likely a 6 that turns into a 5. But again, as opposed to just cutting somebody, potentially getting something for him.
Even if it's a 7th-round pick that you can not use to draft somebody, if you guys have paid attention to me over the last couple of years, 7th-round picks I hate.
We're not a huge 7th-round pick,
but if you trade him for a 7th-round pick that you could then trade for a veteran backup or aging veteran who's got 1 year left on his deal that's going to contribute this year, do it every single time. I'll take, I don't mind a 7th-round draft pick here. Just please trade them away before the draft.
Yeah, and so that's on the offensive side. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I don't think it would ever happen because it's a really hard sell. But if a team, and that's the problem, is how many teams have corners that they'd be willing to trade? That's a legitimate question, because I don't think there's that many in the NFL, quite frankly.
Well, if they're any good.
Right, they're not getting
unless the situation is bad where you're at.
Right, and so you look at it Cleveland's got a couple corners that are a little disgruntled, but it doesn't seem like they're in any hurry, and they probably don't need an offensive lineman. The Ravens don't seem to need an offensive lineman, and they have a guy that's disgruntled. So, you look at it from that perspective, there may not be it would have to be, to me, it would have to be the perfect opportunity, like I said, where, and obviously this is never going to happen, but if you go back a couple of years when the Rams traded for Jalen Ramsey, if you were able to get give up 1 first-round pick and Josh Jones, if he was a kicker where they're like, oh yeah, he's showing that he's good enough. You don't have to give us 2 first-round picks. We'll take Josh Jones. That's the only way I would say you trade him. Like, you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, let's trade for Antonio Coleman, Josh Jones. Like, that's just not going to happen. But like,
No.
if the right fit were to come along, that would be interesting. And then on the defensive side of the ball, I don't think it's going to happen, but the Deontay Thompson situation is one to kind of watch, right?
Yeah, he's not been good enough to get playing time, but hasn't been bad when he's played. And I mean, let's be honest, the safety situation. I don't think
it's the best.
Like, how are you going to crack that line? We got Boot and Jalen. He's in the last year of his deal, and then the guys that they have behind him are more special teams guys who haven't, like Charles Washington. Anytime he's played defense, he's looked okay. James Wiggins has upside that we haven't seen yet, but also has very high upside when it comes to special teams. And so, yeah, defensively, it's hard to do that just because you don't look at the defense because you feel like they're deficient at areas. I think.
What if somebody offered you a 4 that could turn into more for like Dimikage?
Dimikage's an interesting one because of especially if he is the 6th guy in their offense outside linebacker room. Because you've got 5 guys that they're not going to cut, because they're not going to cut Golden, they're not going to cut Kennard. I mean, you might not like it. They're not going to cut him.
Well, he took a huge pay cut.
Yeah, well, and his entire salary is guaranteed. You're not going to pay a guy. Like, it's different than dead money. Dead money is money you've already paid to a guy that counts as the cap. This is legitimate. He will get paid all that money whether or not he plays for your team.
Right. You don't want it to become dead money.
And so Kennard, Gardeck, and then the 2 rookies, the 3rd-rounders, they're going to be on the team. So Dimikage is an interesting one because there's some value there, but and they liked him a year ago.
Right.
And so, you'd hate to trade him and have him turn into a good pass rusher.
Right. And it's a slightly lesser extent of the Josh Jones because it's a 6th versus a 3rd, but it's similar in the sense of premium position that you just don't trade unless you're like 100%. And so that's the thing, is like, you watch him this year and hopefully he plays well enough that you're like, oh yeah, this was a good idea. Because like, even if a team offered a 5th, right, like, so you just got a 1-round boost on him and you're like, no, and then he ends up being a guy you cut next year, then that's a mistake. Like, I get waiting out, but like, you've had this guy for a camp, you've had, and like we said, we've been super impressed with his progress. He's going in the right direction. That's all you can ask for from a 6th-round pick. And
he's a guy, well, mind you, he was kind of a question mark pick a year ago because, but they were, like, the Cardinals as an organization seemed to be more excited about a 6th-round pick than you would normally be in Dimikage.
Yeah. And then you look at, like, obviously special teams, there's really nothing there. I don't really see anything crazy, especially like when you look at the veterans, right? Like, so you obviously they're not going to do this, but like, even if like a Rodney Hudson was still being a problem and wanted out, you would look at it and be like, they just don't have anything behind him where you'd feel comfortable right now. Maybe next year, if Lecitus continues to grow, you do that. But like right now, you're like, really, you want to start Sean Harlow for 17 games? Like, just sounds...
Remember, they were begging Rodney to come back.
Right. Right. So yeah. So I mean, I think the interesting one's going to be, like you said, I think the name that we're thinking is Darrell Williams, but realistically, I think any of those 3 guys in Benjamin Williams or Ward would be somebody that they could listen for instead of cutting, because one of those guys, I mean, and Jess and I could be completely off. Don't take us to the bank that this is inside information or anything like that, but like we're expecting Ingram to be on this roster. And just again, based on how he's played, what he brings that's different than those other three guys. And so like that's the only reason you would say like any of those three guys is because they're more interchangeable than Ingram is.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, Special Cardinals Talk on the Web. We'll come back and start with our roster prediction. How do we think the Cardinals will at least initially structure their 53-man roster before moving forward? So that's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, Special Cardinals Talk on the Web, and it's time for our roster predictions. Obviously, when the Cardinals and the rest of the NFL make their final roster cuts, it's not their final roster cuts, but they do have to get it down to 53 players before they make. So if there's any player who's hurt that they have any chance of that they want to play during the season, they have to be carried to that 53-man roster before they get put on IR, that making it so they could be eligible to come back after 4 games. And then there's the initial 53, and then there's waiver claims, IR moves, and then there's re-signing of players in after that. So what we're going to attempt to do is predict how we think the initial 53 will look like, and then kind of discuss as well what happens initially. What are some possibilities after that initial 53? We'll look at the offensive side of the ball first, and then let's talk quarterback. I think, based on what Cliff Kingsbury said, I think we're pretty much locked in at 3 quarterbacks with Kyler Murray, Colt McCoy, and Trace McSorley. I don't think that they're going to try. I don't think that they will expose McSorley to waivers, even though I personally am a fan of 2 quarterbacks on the roster and 1 on the practice squad. I don't think they're going to risk it. That's just like they did the last 2 seasons. They will go with 3 guys on the 53.
Yeah, I unfortunately think you're right with that right now.
It makes roster building hard, but I just think that's how it's going to be. I would personally keep, Murray McCoy, and then either risk McSorley and let him, and then re-sign to the practice squad. If he likes it, like, he'll come back. Or like if there's the other option is if you like Garantano, sign him to the practice squad and let him develop and run scout team. If you think he's got more upside than McSorley.
I know we talk about this, and I don't want to delve into Trace McSorley too much, but like, man, it feels like it'd be crazy if he got on another roster right away, sans an injury that happened over this week, which also makes this hard because like we're predicting this before like injuries happen and then things get thrown out of whack. But like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm just not a fan, like you said, of the 3 quarterback on the roster thing. We've talked about it with Shrevler the last couple of years, but it is what it is. So then running backs, it's obviously Connor. Are we locking in Eno as the number 2, or are you taking it that this is actual bait, like you said, and that they're going a different way?
I'm keeping 4 running backs here, and I think the odd man out is actually Jonathan Ward, reluctantly.
I would agree with that.
And so, but who's going to be the number 2? I think it's maybe Eno, but probably Darrell Williams or a mix of the 2. And then Keontae Ingram, we'll see what happens with him on his role.
He's the baby this year, and he'll be a big-time contributor next year.
Yeah, that's just the.
And by the way, those are the 4 I would guess as well. And we're saying yes, like we're not trying to be rude, but like this is legitimately tough because after Connor, like I said, the only one that like you definitely keep to me is Ingram.
Yeah,
and then after that, it's like, okay, who has the most
Williams
value?
Williams is the only one who has proven NFL production.
1,000%. And I think that's why he ends up making the roster over Ward. And here's the thing, guys. if it ends up being Eno that gets cut, the reason why is going to be isn't because of Eno the running back. It's because Eno's really only a running back.
Yes. Yeah,
And
instead of
and,
playing
and
special teams, because Jonathan Ward excels on special teams. But it would be highly disappointing if, as much as they've said about Benjamin this offseason, have him not make the team. That would be weird, honestly.
it really would. That takes us to wide receiver, and we know the top three heading into the season with and why don't you explain the suspension thing real quick?
DeAndre Hopkins will not be on the final 53, and he doesn't have to be carried on the 53 because once they do cut down, once that next week happens, he gets moved immediately. He gets moved, bypassed to the suspension list, so he won't count against the 53. It's different than the injured reserve guys. So guys who you want to be eligible to come off on IR have to be on the final 53 initially. Hopkins will just move on over. They don't have to carry him at all, so they don't have to expose anyone else. They don't have to expose an extra player to waivers. So he will be not count. He will just not count. And so do you think they will keep 5 or 6 receivers on that initial final 53?
Man, it's so tough. So, we're at 3 quarterbacks and 4 running backs, so we're at 7. You look at it, it feels like I'm going to skip for a second. It feels like a lock sans an injury that it's going to be Zach Ertz, Max Williams, and Trey McBride as your 3 tight ends.
That's a lock. That's how it's going to be. So tight end's easy.
Yeah. So that takes you to 10 players, and then it becomes the mix and match of the situation of, do you take 6 wide receivers and 9 offensive linemen, or do you take 10 offensive linemen and 5 wide receivers?
Or do you go with an initially unbalanced roster with fewer on offense or fewer on defense?
Defense, yeah. But as you and I talked about, and as we've kind of mentioned, unless you're cutting like a Victor Dimukeje or a Michael Dogby, it's really, really hard to find another position that you're going to cut somebody at. I'm going to say 5. We obviously know the top 3 right off the bat of Green, Brown, and Rondell Moore. Shoot. So Green, Brown, Rondell. It feels like Greg Dortch is a lock right now.
I agree.
So that is 4. And so the question becomes, do you keep Andy Isabella or Antoine Wesley? It'd be really easy if they just put Antoine Wesley on the IR and we didn't have to worry about it. Oh, man. Here's the thing. I'm going to go that they keep Isabella over Antoine Wesley. And the reason I'm going to say that is because I think that even though they're not quite as big size-wise, I think what you've seen out of Javonte Payton, Dontre Kirkland is that they have a similar skill set with slightly more athleticism than Wesley that you're probably going to be able to get onto the practice squad. And quite frankly, let's be honest, Antoine Wesley's been in the NFL for a while, and he wasn't good until he got here.
You're right. That's absolutely right. Now, my take on this is this, and I'll explain, because I think the Cardinals are only going to keep 5 receivers initially, and I think it's because they're going to have to keep an extra offensive lineman, because I think they're going to have to IR someone after the fact. So they're going to have to carry a player that they want to carry. So, and I think, honestly, unless Wesley is going to miss the season, I think he's a lock for the roster. So obviously, A.J. Green, Hollywood Brown, Rondell Moore, locks. I also think that Antoine Wesley and Greg Dortch are locks, and just Andy Isabella is the odd man out. The difference being the only reason I think Andy Isabella makes the roster is if they keep Wesley to then short-term IR him. I know that what Cliff has said thus far, we can't be super confident in it, is that Wesley was a week or two away, which puts him right about the beginning of the season, that first week of being able to, or this week or the week after. So these next couple of weeks before the season starts where he should be able to do some stuff, and then it's touch and go. It feels like they do not want him to go on IR for the year. They don't want him to do surgery because they want to count on him this year. They believe in him as a fourth receiver while Hopkins out and number 5 receiver. After that, I do think they like his upside. And so they're counting on him to perhaps be able to play early in the season. So he will be on the roster. If he's going to have to miss time and be short-term IR'd, then Isabella makes the roster. But other than that, I don't think they can keep more than 5 receivers because of areas I think they're going to have to do. So Isabella's out, whether he's traded or cut, and you keep Dortch and Wesley, and then you've got your top 3. And I think the number of receivers becomes a little less important because of the tight end situation. You've got 3 tight ends who can play, and you've got a guy in Zach Ertz who's going to be on the field almost every down. So 10 personnel will be rare this year.
Yeah, and then from there we go to the other really difficult one, which is the offensive line, right? So your starters are, barring injury, your starters are Humphreys, Pugh, Hudson, Hernandez, and Kelvin Beachum. And then Josh Jones is 100% a lock. After that, I would say Sean Harlow's a 100% lock. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And Cody Ford's a lock now.
And Cody Ford, now that he's on the roster, is a lock. So that takes us to 8. So then the question becomes, do they keep both rookies? And this is where you and I are doing some speculation, putting some pieces together. Because we think that they're going to keep both Lecitus Smith and Marquis Hayes, with the idea that they're likely to IR Marquis Hayes once the season starts, so he's eligible to come back later in the season if need be. And it's not necessarily that they want him back to play.
It's because they want him on the roster because they see a future with him.
Right.
They really like him.
They want him on the roster, and they want him to be able to come back and practice.
Yes.
And here's the thing. If you IR a player for the full season and then they get caught practicing, you're in trouble. So this is Jess and I speculating, but I think that is why they traded for Cody Ford. Obviously, there was an issue with the interior offensive line. Yes, in the last game, we talked about it. Lecitus Smith basically gets a pass for this year because they're asking him to do something he's never done before, and so it's a really hard transition to make to play center, because now you're not just having to worry about going to block incredible players in front of you. Now you have to snap the ball first and then go block incredible players in front of you. Yes. And so when you've never done it, it's going to take, a season. But man, they really liked Hayes, and it's really disappointing that he wasn't able to play in this game. And then when they traded for Ford, it really signaled to Jess and I that there must, unless they're going to only somehow keep 9 players.
I don't think there's any way that they can keep 9 players.
Well, here's the only way it works. And so both of us have 10. That's what we're going with.
Which means, but we have to know it. That means Justin Murray is cut.
Yep.
And Josh Miles.
And Josh Miles, yeah. But here is the only way keeping 9 works. The only way. So if Hayes is healthy, obviously, is the first part. But they're confident that Justin Pugh can slide over to center if anything happens to Rodney Hudson and they cut Sean Harlow. That's the only way keeping 9 works.
And I don't see that happening because
I don't either, but that's the only.
They're very confident about Harlow. I could see possibly, if they only want to keep 9, if Hayes is going to be okay, that they do cut Lacita Smith and practice squad him.
Right.
Because I think, as a 6th round draft pick, it's not like there was high interest in him to begin with. Right. And the film that he's got.
Right, I was going to say, and you've made him look really bad.
He's playing center and has been very uneven. And so I don't know if they're that's the only thing. But I think with both those young offensive line, I think the organization sees a future for both of them and does not want kind of, like they did with Josh Miles. Josh Miles was a player that the first 2 years where you're like, why is he on the roster? Because they're developing these players and believe that there is a future for them.
Yeah, and you guys got to remember before you're like, well, now you're cutting Josh Miles. You have to remember that they drafted Miles before they realized what Kelvin Beachum had left.
Right, they drafted Josh. So then they signed Kelvin Beachum, and then they drafted Josh Jones. So
yeah, and so like for the first time.
But look, 7th round pick. If you get 3 years on a roster of a 7th round pick. Right. That's a success. Let's be honest.
That's a win. And the fact of the matter is, and you and I have talked about this before, this is literally the first time when you feel like they've done a good job preparing for the offensive line. And so what that means is, now you actually have some difficult decisions to make cut-wise because all of a sudden you've got good players.
Yeah. That's absolutely the truth. Coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the Web, we will wrap this up and talk about defense and special teams. We're both at 25 players on offense. That means we got 25 players on defense coming up. That's coming up next on Rise of C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the Web. We move to the defensive side of the ball. I thought I might have to go unbalanced offense-defense, and I didn't. On the defensive line, I have them keeping 6 players. I think 5 are a lock. J.J. Watt, Zach Allen, Rashard Lawrence, Lecky Fotu, and Michael Dogby. I think all 5 of those are locks. So I think also that 6 is a given, that they will bring in 6. And so the question is, who is that 6th guy? And you've got 4 guys competing for it. You've got Jonathan Ledbetter, who's played the most out of all the defensive linemen. You've got Antoine Woods, who's kind of a true nose tackle veteran. You've got Christian Ringo, who played really well in the first game. And then you've got the undrafted rookie Manny Jones, a guy who they really like.
I was going to say, Jones they love. And so there's one of 2 ways to think about the Jones situation. And you're right. I think the 5 you named are locked, right? So there's a couple ways to look at the Jones situation. It's either that they love him and they're going to keep him, or they love him and they're going to try and pass him to the practice squad and get him there. It's interesting because his play at that left end position, when you look at how they start out, right? So along the defensive line, they started out with Dogby, Lawrence, and Ledbetter there, and then Gardeck and Kennard on the edges. Jones played similarly, I'll say, to kind of how they used Myjai Sanders. They didn't stand Sanders up every down. Similar with Cameron Thomas. So, all that being said, I do wonder if they could sneak 5, so to speak, if they think that they can get away with like a Cam Thomas getting into the rotation there. But to your point, I think it's going to be Ledbetter at this point.
I agree. That Ledbetter is the guy that I had on the roster as well. But honestly, and part of that is because because the rest of you've got Watt, young guys that the Cardinals brought, Ledbetter, Ringo, Woods all have some experience in the league, and
he gives them a little comfort backup situation.
Now, granted, I'll say this: Ledbetter doesn't. That's not an example because he's been in the league as long as Michael Ogby.
But he's played, and that's, to your point, he's played. Like you said, Woods is very one-dimensional, and he's probably a guy that's going to be available, either him or a player in similar structure to him. I mean, you look at the defensive linemen that are still available out there. I mean, you've got guys like Sheldon Richardson that's still out there. You've got Linval Joseph, who's like a superior version of Antoine Woods. Like, so that's the thing, is like we talked about with running back. I mean, hell, you could go back and bring in Kinsley Keke if you needed to.
There's always that too. He didn't get picked up anyway. Outside linebacker. This is a really interesting one, and this is where, for me, because of quarterback and offensive line and outside linebacker, it squeezes players off the roster at other positions, because they have 7 players who I think they'd like to have on the roster, and they probably should only carry 5, honestly, in terms of roster building. But they're gonna keep 6. 5 of the guys are locks. I mean, there's no way around it. They're gonna keep Marcus Golden. Devon Kennard, his entire salary is guaranteed. He's on the roster. Dennis Gardeck signed a new he's on the roster. And then you got 2 third-round picks in Cam Thomas and Myjai Sanders. Those guys are on the roster. So those 5 players guaranteed are making the team, barring a season-ending injury that has one of them landing on injured reserve.
Yeah, and that leaves,
Is it Dimakaji or is it Jesse Luketa?
And they're similar types of players, wouldn't you say? Like,
Dimakaji is the more experienced player because he played as a pass rusher. He played as a pass rusher at Duke, and then has a year under his belt with the Cardinals, where he also played special teams last season. Luketa, who was an off-the-ball linebacker who moved to the edge this last season. But Steve Keim is absolutely in love with this guy. He is a football player, a guy you love in the locker room. He hits violently, and he will be a dog on special teams. That said, my prediction, Luketa will be on the practice squad and elevated to the roster as a special teams guy.
Yeah,
because I don't think he will get claimed, and I think Dimakaji, barring a trade, will also make the roster. Although, honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if he gets cut. But I know that they liked Dimakaji coming out, and add into the fact the progress that he's made, because he's earned specific unsolicited praise from Cliff Kingsbury as well from the offseason. And it's not just what he showed in the games, is that he had praise from how he's looked in practice in the offseason. So combine that with the production in the preseason, you feel like that he's probably going to make the roster.
Are we capping or Vontarius Doring ourselves here?
I'm careful with that. I'm very careful with that.
I'm with you though. I think they would like, and here's the thing. If they had Chandler Jones and Marcus Golden, I think it would be a much different conversation.
Right. And they wouldn't have drafted the 2 pass rushers in the same round.
Yeah, probably. But even if they had Chandler Jones still, and then they drafted the 2 guys, they're like, hey, Jones, you're here for 3 more years, but Golden's only signed for 1 more year, which he is. And so we're going to have 2 guys ready to go. It makes it a lot easier to move on from Dimakaji, and then the discussion becomes about Luketa, right? Like you said, he's a dog on special teams. Like, he's just learning how to rush the passer. He's similar to like a Dennis Gardeck. Obviously, he's not as freaky athletic as Gardeck was coming out, but like similar in that sense of like this whirling dervish, special teams, like barbarian type of guy.
But he is, I will say this, he is built to play the edge. Gardick, very undersized. Very undersized. Luquette is 6'3", 250. He packs a punch when he hits you.
Yeah, and so that's the thing when you look at it from that perspective. Like, this isn't a conversation, but because there's so many question marks about their pass rush situation, I don't think you can cut Demikagi right now and Luquetta, if that makes sense. Yeah. So they're going to keep 6. It's just a matter of, I think we're going to go and see that they keep Demikagi, the guy that can rush the passer, over a guy who might be able to rush the passer in the next year or two, but is more of a special teams only guy right now.
At inside linebacker, a position where I thought they would keep 6, I only had room for 5, and it was 5 guys that are locks for the roster. Zaven Collins, Isaiah Simmons, Nick Vigil, Zeke Turner, and Tanner Vallejo, who, as I mentioned on previous shows, I didn't know was a lock for the roster, but the fact that he got thrown to the very back of the preseason depth chart, along with Nick Vigil
and Isaiah Simmons,
you're like, oh, okay, he's making the team. So I always felt that there was probably a 6th spot, but I just didn't have any room on the roster, and I felt that Ben Neiman and Joe Walker were both competing for the same spot to mainly play special teams. Chandler Wooten suddenly is in the conversation. I don't want to get too excited about a guy making a play in the second half of a preseason game.
Especially when he didn't have to do much to make the play.
Right.
No offense, Chandler.
Right. But I'd say all I could keep were 5. And so I just didn't have room for it. So whether they keep 6, and then it comes down to, is it Neiman, is it Walker? Walker obviously has the trust of Vance Joseph. He is a guy that seems to make his way onto rosters year after year, which is great for him. And he's a smart, heady football player who does just enough. But he's a guy you're always looking to replace. Ben Neiman has played more, but he's new to the system, and he's played a ton in the preseason. Nonetheless, I don't think there's room for either one.
Yeah, and quite frankly, either one of them would be, you'd probably be able to pick them up at the after cuts were happening. So I'm on the same boat. I mean, because we had to keep Trace McSorley. Oh man, and then our speculation on Marquis Hayes right now. I think that's where they're going. I'm not, and here's the thing. So I think Simmons is going to be on the field every down. I think Simmons is going to play a lot of different places, which allows our next conversation to make more sense of why you only keep 8 defensive backs.
Which that doesn't feel like you should, but
right.
But also, when it comes to initial roster building, this also means there could be a cornerback off of waivers.
1,000%.
Who are the 4? So I've got 4 corners and 4 safeties. I think we can agree that the 3 corners are locked in Byron Murphy, Marco Wilson, Antonio Hamilton. With a what if? Do you think the Cardinals would deal Marco Wilson? Is there any chance of that?
I mean, you never say never with this team and this organization. Like, you really don't. I think that those 3 are locks, and I think that Christian Matthew is as close to a lock as possible because he's a different breed. We talked about Josh Jackson, and he hasn't been good, but he hasn't been awful.
Yeah.
But you see the limitations and why he was a 3rd-round pick on a team that has had a lot of success draft. Oh, sorry. He was a 2nd-round pick.
He was.
Holy cow. And they've had a ton of success drafting and developing defensive backs. And then he went to a team that was desperate for corner help
and couldn't crack the rotation.
And could not crack the rotation, man. And then he got put on the practice squad. So like I could see that happening again. Where he ends up as a practice squad guy.
And Christian Matthew is the guy it came down to. Honestly, it could come down to 3 players. It's Josh Jackson, Christian Matthew, and Jace Whitaker. Jace Whitaker has been practice squad elevated each of the last 2 seasons, and he's a guy that the Cardinals coaching staff trusts inherently because he knows the defense. He's just very limited as a player. And so I don't put him on the roster because I think Christian Matthew is a 7th round pick because of the physical upside and at least some of the flashes that he's shown gives you the hope that that he can at least be a dog on special teams, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think you look at it, so you got Hamilton, Murphy, and you look at their safeties, and you have Budda Baker and Jalen Thompson. Both guys can play in the slot if need be. And then we talked about Isaiah Simmons, like only keeping 4, and if you make that 4th one, Christian Matthew, makes sense because of the multiple abilities of Baker, Thompson, and Simmons.
So when it comes down to the last 2 safety spots, you've got 3. I'm not even going to consider Tay Daly. I'm just going to dismiss him.
I was going to say he's done a nice job. He might.
Like the one thing you notice about him. Ooh, he likes to hit.
Yeah, and he might be a guy that ends up on a practice squad, either here or somewhere in the NFL. But it's coming down to, in our eyes, barring getting information about Charles Washington's health. It's coming down to a choice between Deontay Thompson, who is in the last year of his deal, or James Wiggins, who is the younger and much more athletic, but not nearly as trustworthy on defense now.
Correct. But
as Deontay Thompson.
But they love his future as a gunner, which makes him competition for Charles Washington, who is a very established punt gunner. Barring Charles Washington having a serious chest injury that will actually... He's coming off a year where he played real little. He had a serious hamstring injury. My pick is Wiggins and Washington, with Deontay Thompson being the odd man out, simply because you've got a third safety in Isaiah Simmons who can play safety. And then Wiggins and Washington then become your special teams guys. But if Washington ends up being hurt, then that brings DT back into the picture.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I mean, you look at this roster realistically, there are coin flips at a number of positions, but there's nothing crazy. And so we differ on Isabella Wesley right now. There's questions about if they're going to keep McSorley, which it seems like you said, almost like a lock that they will. Do they keep 4 running backs, or do they just carry 3? It feels like they're going to keep 4, but like you said, that might be the Benjamin pub tour in order to see if you can do anything with him. The offensive line we've discussed, it's going to be, this is a tough offensive line to crack, which is something nice to finally say about this organization. And then the defensive line and line or outside backers are kind of the opposite. Like, you're really comfortable naming the top 3. And then after that, who the backups are kind of by default, but you're like, hopefully that, these guys end up showing a little more, to prove it, which then takes the better quote unquote players right now, let's be honest, Deontay Thompson's had a better NFL career and is a more trustworthy player than a Victor Dimukeje. But because of the needs of the team, it feels more like Timmy KG needs to be on the roster than Deontay Thompson, right?
Well, of course, and especially because he plays a premium position where there's a lot of uncertainty, as opposed to Thompson, who plays a less premium position where they have great certainty and talent.
Right. And so, like, that's how you have to look at this. Like, I don't, and maybe Jess and I are wrong sometimes, and we definitely have been in the past, and we will be in the future when it comes to this. But at the same time, we're very confident that, like, we're talking through it in a way that allows us to make smart decisions that will likely, we'll miss some, but like it makes sense to us how we build the roster. And
Absolutely.
do we need to mention Andy Lee, Aaron Brewer, and Matt Prater?
Well, since they cut the other punter on the roster, and the only specialists left are the three, I think those guys are a lock. And hopefully Matt Prater works through his process through the preseason so that he's gotten all of those kinks worked out before the regular season, and that Andy Lee has enough leg to last through this.
Right. That's the big thing. Is poor Andy Lee going to hold up? Like, I mean, I'm happy for him. It's cool to have a 48-year-old or whatever he is now. Like, you guys graduated the same year, didn't you, in high school?
No. Like, there is no NFL. Like, thanks to Phil Dawson being done and Mike Vinatieri being done, I am now older than every NFL player there is. Even Tom Brady, I am older by several months than Tom Brady. So,
dude, it's so crazy to think about that this dude was drafted the year I graduated from high school. Like, I've been out of high school for 18 years now, and this dude has been in the league longer. Like, what an insane career, but good for him, man. Like, seriously, good for him.
Yep. So, yeah, not that I had any hopes of an NFL career to begin with, because I didn't even play high school football. So, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this extended edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals Talk and Love. This is episode 369. We will be back next week, as our next show will be reacting to the final roster, at least the initial final roster, as we move ahead and look toward the regular season. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. This is the Rise Up C-Red podcast, and we'll be back again next week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise up Sea Red.
Rise up! Rise!